Hello everyone, I'm back. What are you all up to? How's your day going? I hope it's been good. Are you ready to relax, listen to our short story, and drift off to sleep? So sit back, unwind, and let's begin. Today we bring you a historical story titled, Why Carl Jung's Ideas Still Resonate Today. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakens? Carl Jung wrote these words after deliberately going mad. For 4 years, he spoke with invisible beings and wrote down their answers. This was a successful Swiss psychiatrist, gambling his reputation on visions that looked like psychosis. His colleagues whispered that he'd lost his mind, but Jung kept going deeper, darker until he returned with a map of the underworld. Before we start, a quick note. And if you enjoy our work, a like and subscribe helps other restless minds find these stories. Finally, let us know in the comments which figure you'd like to hear about next. Now, that terrifying gamble with sanity, the one Carl Jung chose to take, serves as our guide into the inner worlds we are so often taught to fear. Have you ever had a recurring dream you couldn't explain? Or felt drawn to people you know are wrong for you? Or perhaps you've sabotaged your own success and been left wondering why? Well, in this episode of Bedtime Biographies, we'll see how one man's journey suggests the answers lie in a place we are taught to avoid, our own darkness. Tonight we recount Jung's life in order to understand the map he brought back for all of us. By the end, you'll understand that his voluntary descent into madness and his subsequent return carries the keys to understanding your own depths. This is the Bedtime Biography of Carl Jung. Chapter 1. The Swiss Soil. Carl was born in Switzerland on July 26, 1875, a country whose particular character would shape everything he became. To understand Jung, you have to understand his homeland. Switzerland was what one writer called a national park of the spirit, a place where citizens voted on major issues directly, where individual responsibility ran deeper than in most nations. This was a country rooted in peasant soil, where instinct and nature held more weight than purely urban concerns. Switzerland had turned inward for over 400 years. The nation chose internal political quarrels over external wars. This meant Jung grew up without that particular psychology of seeing evil only in neighboring countries. Instead, the Swiss looked inward for conflict. This national trait of examining one's own darkness would become the foundation of Jung's entire approach to the human psyche. He would later call this confrontation with the shadow. Jung was fiercely Swiss. He served enthusiastically in the army, which he considered an anchor to his identity during his most disorienting inner explorations. The practical, grounded nature of Swiss life kept him tethered when his mind ventured into territory that might have swept others away entirely. He was a product of this soil, practical yet profoundly inward-looking. His childhood unfolded in the quiet riverside town of Kessel, then later in Klein-Hüningen near Basel. Roman ruins crumbled gently into the Rhine. Vineyards stretched sleepy and green under summer sun. But beneath this pastoral surface, the boy experienced inner events that would mark him forever. Between the ages of 3 and 4, Jung had a dream that would preoccupy him his entire life. He descended stone steps into the earth. There, in an underground chamber, he encountered something that terrified him. A giant, flesh-cold form on a golden throne. His mother's voice called it the man-eater. This dream initiated him into what he would later call the secrets of the earth. It was the beginning of his intellectual life, a preview of the creative force that would drive him. By age 11, Jung felt split in two. There was personality number 1, the ordinary schoolboy who struggled with mathematics and disappointed his teachers. Then there was personality number 2, a wise, timeless presence who seemed to have lived in the 18th century. This wasn't madness. It was his first intuition of the relationship between the conscious ego and something larger, something eternal within. Around this time came another vision that would shape him. Sitting outside Basel Cathedral on a bright day, he fought against a thought trying to break through. For days he resisted. Finally, he surrendered. He saw God on his throne above the cathedral. Then God dropped an enormous turd that shattered his own church. Instead of damnation, Jung felt an unutterable bliss. He understood something crucial, that the divine refused to be bound by human tradition. God embraced both creation and destruction. These secrets made him profoundly alone. He couldn't share them with anyone. Not his pastor father who preached without conviction. Not his mother who had her own strange moments of otherworldly absence. Not his schoolmates who lived in a different universe entirely. This isolation would become both his burden and his strength. It forced him to develop an inner life of extraordinary depth. The Swiss soil had produced something unusual in Carl Jung, a boy who thought in images rather than words, who experienced the divine as something wild and contradictory, who felt himself connected to something ancient running beneath the orderly surface of Swiss life. This foundation would support everything that came after: his break with Freud, his descent into the unconscious, his discovery of the collective patterns that shape all human experience. Chapter 2. Two personalities and a terrible secret. The split in Jung's nature became more pronounced as he grew. Personality number 1 went to school, tried to fit in, failed at mathematics. This was the boy who got into fights, who disappointed his teachers, who seemed destined for an ordinary life. But personality number 2 lived in another realm entirely. This was the ancient one, the one who knew things without learning them, who felt connected to the stones and the mountains in the centuries before. School was torture, not because Jung lacked intelligence, but because he couldn't reconcile these two worlds. During a geometry lesson, his teacher accused him of cheating on a paper. Jung hadn't cheated, but he couldn't prove it. The injustice burned. More than that, it confirmed his sense that the outer world of rules and proofs had nothing to do with the real truth living inside him. At 12, something shifted. A classmate shoved him, and Jung's head struck the pavement. He lay there longer than necessary, a thought flashing through his mind. Now you won't have to go to school. For 6 months, he had fainting spells whenever school approached. His parents grew desperate. Doctors found nothing wrong. Jung overheard his father telling a friend that he feared what would become of his son if he proved incurable, as he had no money to support him. The words hit Jung like cold water. He forced himself back to his father's study, opened a Latin grammar, immediately felt the faintness approaching. He fought it with everything he had. After an hour, it retreated. He never fainted again. This was his first conscious victory over his own psyche, his first understanding that the mind could create illness and through will overcome it. But the terrible secret remained. That vision of God destroying his own cathedral haunted Jung. He searched his father's theological books for answers, found nothing but dead formulas. His father preached every Sunday about God's love and grace, but Jung saw the doubt in his eyes. Paul Jung didn't believe his own sermons. He was trapped in a faith that had lost its living core. The confirmation classes came. Jung hoped for revelation, for someone to explain the mystery of communion. Instead, he got more empty ritual. When he took his first communion, he felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. The other boys seemed transported. Jung sat there, the wafer dissolving on his tongue, thinking, "This is all dead." The church had failed him completely. These experiences drove Jung deeper into himself. He read voraciously Goethe, Faust, Schopenhauer, Kant. He discovered that others had felt this split between outer conformity and inner truth. He wasn't insane. He was simply seeing what others refused to see. The world operated on two levels. Most people lived only on the surface, but underneath in the depths moved forces that the churches and schools never mentioned. Forces that could shatter cathedrals and heal fainting boys and speak through dreams of underground chambers. Chapter 3. The call to psychiatry. Jung entered Basel University in 1895, 19 years old and still uncertain of his path. Medicine seemed practical. His family had no money for anything impractical, but underneath ran a deeper current. He wanted to understand the strange experiences that had marked his childhood. He wanted to know why minds could split, why God appeared in dreams, why fainting spells could be cured by will alone. His father died in 1896. Paul Jung had lost his faith years before, and now he lost his life. The family was left with almost nothing. At 20, Jung became responsible for his mother and sister. His uncle told him bluntly that this was how one learns to be a man. Jung sold antiques on commission. He worked as an assistant. He ate one meal a day when money ran thin. Then came the incidents that defied explanation. Jung sat studying with his mother in the dining room. A sound like a pistol shot rang out. Their solid walnut table, 70 years old, had split straight across. No change in temperature, no tension in the wood, just an impossible crack running through solid timber. 2 weeks later, another explosion. In the sideboard, a steel bread knife had shattered into 4 pieces. The blade lay broken in the drawer, surrounded by undisturbed linens. These events pulled Jung toward the occult, not as a believer, but as an investigator. His relatives held seances with a young cousin who claimed to channel spirits. Jung attended with a notebook, recording everything. The girl spoke in different voices, claimed past lives, described the architecture of the spirit world. Most of it was clearly fantasy, but occasionally something genuine seemed to break through. Some knowledge she couldn't possibly have, some change in her face that went beyond acting. Medical school ground on surgery, internal medicine, pathology. Jung felt no calling to any of it. On the eve of his final exams, still undecided on a specialty, he picked up a psychiatric textbook by Krafft Ebing. The preface stated that psychiatric textbooks always reflected the subjective views of their authors more than other medical texts. That psychiatry was the stepchild of medicine, working in the dark with little respect from other doctors. Lightning struck. This was it. Psychiatry was where natural science met the spiritual world, where doctors wrestled with the same forces that had split his table and shattered his knife, where the human soul revealed itself in all its terrible complexity. His friends were horrified. Psychiatry was professional suicide. The asylums were dumping grounds. The patients were hopeless. Jung didn't care. He had found his calling. In 1900, he took a position at the Berg-Kuesli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. He stood before the locked doors, 24 years old, carrying everything he owned in a single suitcase. Behind those doors waited the mad, the broken, the ones who lived in the same split world he had known since childhood. He was coming home. Chapter 4, Berg-Holsli and the Unconscious. The Berg-Holsli Psychiatric Hospital stood on Zolliberg Hill overlooking Zurich. When Jung arrived in December 1900, snow covered the grounds. The building itself was modern, progressive. Under Eugen Bleuler's direction, it had become one of Europe's leading psychiatric institutions. Bleuler believed in understanding patients, not just restraining them. This radical approach attracted Jung immediately. Jung felt overwhelmed. He later wrote that he understood nothing at all. The medical training at Basel hadn't prepared him for this. He moved into the hospital, living among the patients and staff. For 6 months, he read obsessively 50 volumes of the Allgemeine Zeitschrift Psychiatrie, every case history he could find. He needed to understand what madness actually was. Beyond the classifications and Latin names, the patients taught him more than the textbooks. There was Babette, an old woman who had spent decades in the hospital. She spoke in strange word salads that other doctors dismissed as meaningless. Jung listened differently. He noticed patterns. When she said she was the Lorelei, or that Naples and I must supply the world with noodles, Jung heard something beneath the surface. These weren't random firings of a broken brain. They were symbolic communications from a psyche that had retreated into its own mythological world. The association experiment changed everything. Jung and Franz Ricklin modified the existing test. They paid attention to what others ignored. When Jung said, "mother," and a patient took 12 seconds to respond with "kind," that delay meant something. The complex had been touched. Something emotional, unresolved, was interfering with the simple task of word association. They could measure the unconscious. They could prove it existed. Jung tested the method on himself and colleagues. Everyone had complexes. The difference between the normal and the pathological wasn't the existence of complexes, but their intensity. A normal person might hesitate slightly at certain words. A neurotic might be thrown into confusion. A psychotic might be completely overwhelmed. The complexes in psychotics had become autonomous. They lived their own lives, creating voices and visions. One case haunted Jung. A woman named Sabina Spielrein arrived in 1904, screaming and fighting. She was brilliant, multilingual, but tormented by sexual and aggressive fantasies. Jung spent hours with her, not analyzing from a distance, but engaging with her inner world. She improved dramatically. Later, she would become a psychoanalyst herself. But the intensity of their relationship, the way her complexes resonated with his own, showed Jung how dangerous this work could be. The doctor could be infected by the patient's madness, or perhaps discover his own. It was this work that led Jung to Freud. The interpretation of dreams confirmed what Jung was finding. The unconscious had its own logic. Dreams weren't meaningless, but were compensatory, balancing conscious attitudes. When Jung read Freud's work, he felt less alone. Here was another explorer of the dark territories. In 1906, Jung sent Freud his studies in word association. Freud responded enthusiastically. The correspondence began, but even then, Jung had reservations. Freud reduced everything to sexuality and childhood trauma. Jung saw patients whose delusions contained mythological themes they'd never studied. The schizophrenic man described visions that matched ancient mythic liturgies. How could personal sexual trauma explain that? Jung began collecting these parallels. The psychotic patients at Berg Holtzley weren't just sick. They were drowning in the same mythological material that mystics and visionaries had experienced throughout history. Emma re-entered his life during this period. Having first met her and felt an instant conviction they would marry while he was still a student, their relationship deepened, and they married in 1903. She came from wealth, the Raschenbach industrial fortune. This freed Jung from financial worry, but created other tensions. Emma had to accept that her husband disappeared into his study for days, that he might suddenly announce they were conducting seances in the house, that patients might live with them for months. She began studying mathematics and Latin, later psychology, trying to enter his world. By 1905, Jung was senior physician. He had his own wards, his own assistants. He introduced work therapy, having patients engage in meaningful tasks rather than sitting idle. He noticed that paranoid patients often improved when given responsibility. The therapeutic community itself could heal. But Jung grew restless. The hospital routine constrained him. He needed freedom to pursue the larger patterns he was seeing, the mythological dimensions of madness, the collective layers beneath individual neurosis. His reputation spread. American doctors visited to learn the association method. Jung gave lectures, wrote papers, but inside he felt a growing split. The medical model explained too little. Diagnosis and classification missed the meaning of madness. Each patient was living out a story, a myth that connected to something beyond personal history. In 1909, after 9 transformative years, Jung resigned from Berg-Holtzley. He had learned what institutional psychiatry could teach. Now he needed to venture into territories no hospital could contain. Chapter 5. The Break with Freud. The house in Cayenne rose from Jung's own vision. 3 stories of stone and timber on the shore of Lake Zurich. He designed it himself. In 1908, every room planned for his growing family and his work. Emma was pregnant with their 4th child. The place had consulting rooms, a library, space for the patients who sometimes lived with them. Moving there in 1909 marked Jung's independence from institutional psychiatry. But another break was coming. That same year, Jung sailed to America with Freud and Sandor Ferry. Clark University had invited them to lecture. During the 7-week journey, they analyzed each other's dreams daily. It was intimate, intense, but cracks appeared. Freud refused to share certain dreams, saying he couldn't risk his authority. Jung was stunned. This wasn't scientific collaboration. This was a father demanding obedience from his sons. Jung's house dream came during the voyage. He found himself in a house he somehow knew was his own. The upper floor was decorated in Art Deco style, elegant but superficial. Descending stairs, he discovered a ground floor from medieval times. Stone walls, ancient furniture. A heavy door led to stone steps going down. The cellar was Roman with brick walls and a dusty floor. In the floor, a ring. He pulled it. More stairs descended into a cave cut from rock. Scattered on the floor were pottery shards, bones, and 2 human skulls, very old and half disintegrated. Freud pressed for interpretation. What did the skulls represent? Jung knew what Freud wanted: death wishes towards someone close. That's what Freudian theory demanded. Jung mentioned his wife and sister-in-law. Freud was satisfied, but Jung knew he'd betrayed his own understanding. The dream wasn't about personal death wishes. It was an image of the psyche itself, consciousness on top, then personal unconscious, then deeper layers containing the history of humanity itself, a collective unconscious. Back in Europe, Jung threw himself into mythology. He read everything: Greek myths, Germanic legends, Egyptian mysteries. The same patterns appeared everywhere: the hero's journey, the great mother, the wise old man, the shadow. These weren't transmitted through culture alone. Psychotic patients who'd never studied mythology spontaneously produced the same symbols. A factory worker drew mandalas identical to Tibetan designs he'd never seen. In 1910, Jung was elected president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud had pushed for this, wanting his Gentile crown prince to make psychoanalysis respectable. But at the same Congress, cracks widened. Freud demanded absolute loyalty to the sexual theory. He called it their dogma, their unshakable bulwark against occultism. Jung felt sick. Science didn't have dogmas, religions did. Jung started writing Symbols of Transformation in 1911. He analyzed the fantasies of a young American woman he'd never met, showing how her visions paralleled ancient myths. The libido wasn't just sexual energy, but psychic energy that could take many forms. The psyche had its own purposes beyond personal pleasure or trauma. Every page moved further from Freud. He knew what this book would cost. His entire professional circle was Freudian. Publishing it meant isolation. Emma begged him to reconsider. For months, Jung couldn't write the final chapter. Then he forced himself. Better to lose everything than betray his own understanding. The book appeared in 1912. Freud's response was swift and brutal. Jung was a mystic, a traitor, mentally disturbed. Their final meeting came at a Munich conference in November 1912. They were discussing the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep. Freud insisted the pharaoh had erased his father's name from monuments out of hatred. Jung disagreed. It was about religious differences, not personal father complex. Freud grew agitated. Suddenly, he fell from his chair in a dead faint. Jung caught him, carried him to a couch. When Freud's eyes opened, he looked at Jung with undisguised fury. The correspondence deteriorated. Freud wrote that Jung's ideas came from neurosis. Jung shot back that Freud reduced all disagreement to pathology, treating colleagues like patients. By January 1913, Jung resigned his presidency. By April, the personal relationship was dead. Jung was 37, professionally destroyed, friendless in his field. But something else was happening. Without Freud's framework to contain them, Jung's own unconscious contents began erupting. Visions of floods of blood covering Europe, cities of the dead, catastrophe approaching. He thought he was going psychotic. He didn't know these were visions of the World War that would begin in 1914. He only knew that having lost his outer supports, he was falling into an inner abyss. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 6. Confrontation with the Unconscious. The years after Freud were the most dangerous of Jung's life. He felt the ground disappearing beneath him. Strange moods came, pressure in his skull, dreams of corpses, of blood-soaked lands. In October 1913, traveling alone, he had a vision. A monstrous flood covered Europe. The Alps rose higher to protect Switzerland. Yellow waves carried floating bodies. Then the water turned to blood. The vision returned 2 weeks later. A voice said it would become real. Jung thought he was developing schizophrenia. He knew the signs from Berg-Holdley. The mythological visions, the voices, the sense of prophetic mission. He considered stopping his practice. How could he treat patients when he was losing his own mind? Then August 1914 arrived. World War I began. The blood covering Europe was real blood. Jung understood the visions weren't personal psychosis. They were eruptions from the collective unconscious, premonitions of collective disaster. This gave him courage for what he had to do next. He decided to drop all defenses and let the unconscious come. This was scientific exploration, not surrender. On December 12, 1913, he sat at his desk and deliberately let go. He fell through darkness. Then his feet hit ground. He was in a cave. An old man with a white beard stood beside a beautiful young woman. The man introduced himself as Elijah. The woman was Salami. They had a companion, a large black serpent. Jung learned to enter these visions consciously. He called it active imagination. He wasn't just observing fantasies. He was participating, asking questions, demanding answers. The figures had their own personalities, their own knowledge. Philemon appeared, an old man with kingfisher wings. He taught Jung about the reality of the psyche. Thoughts weren't things you made. They were things that happened to you. Every evening, Jung descended into these visions. He wrote everything in journals, painted the images. The material was overwhelming. Mythological figures, geometric patterns, scenes of ritual and transformation. He had to develop techniques to stay grounded. He saw patience. He carved stone. He sailed his boat on the lake. His family became his anchor to consensus reality. Emma watched her husband disappear into his study each night. She heard him talking to invisible presences. She could have had him committed. Instead, she held the household together. She raised their 5 children while Jung wrestled with forces that might have destroyed him. Later, she would become an analyst herself, understanding from inside what those years had cost. The most humiliating moment came when inner voices commanded him to play. A grown man, a doctor building little cities with stones on the lake shore. But Jung obeyed. As he built, memories surfaced. Childhood games, forgotten dreams. The play reconnected him to the creative force that exists before rational thought. This was individuation, the process of becoming whole, not rising above the primitive, but integrating it. Chapter 7. The frontiers open and the tower. After the war ended in 1918, Jung emerged from his descent changed. The visions continued, but less urgently. He needed to give them form. In 1923, he bought land in Bellingen on the upper lake of Zurich. Remote, quiet, accessible only by foot or boat, he would build something there with his own hands. The tower began as a simple round structure. Jung laid every stone himself. No electricity, no running water, cooking over fire, drawing water from the lake. He carved inscriptions in Latin and images from his visions. This wasn't regression, it was connection to something essential. Here he could be personality number 2 completely, the timeless man who existed outside modern time. Word of Jung's work spread. English and American students arrived. They weren't looking for Freudian analysis. They wanted what Jung offered, a psychology that included the spiritual dimension. Among them came wealthy Americans who would fund his projects. Edith Rockefeller McCormick, daughter of John D. Rockefeller, moved to Zurich specifically to work with Jung. In 1916, Jung founded the Psychological Club in Zurich, not for group therapy, which he despised, but to give his patients community. Individual analysis could isolate people. They needed others who understood the process. The club became a strange mixing ground. Swiss burghers, American AES, English intellectuals, all united by their confrontation with the unconscious. Jung insisted you cannot individuate on Mount Everest. The process required engagement with ordinary life, marriage, work, social responsibilities. These weren't distractions from spiritual development. They were the testing ground. Anyone could have visions in isolation. The real work was integrating those visions while maintaining relationships, earning money, raising children. The tower grew over the years. Jung added sections as his psyche developed. A second tower in 1927 after his mother died, a hall in 1935, an upper story in 1945 after Emma's death. Each addition marked an inner transformation, made concrete in stone. Visitors found it unsettling. Time moved differently there. Jung might spend weeks alone cooking simple meals, carving stone, living a rhythm unchanged since medieval times. His practice in Kishnok flourished. Patients came from around the world. But Jung was selective. He wouldn't treat anyone who wasn't serious about inner work. He might prescribe unusual tasks. Paint your dreams, dance your feelings, talk to your symptoms. One woman who complained of stomach problems was told to let her stomach speak. It had plenty to say about what she'd been swallowing in her marriage. The work was dangerous. Some patients couldn't handle what emerged. A few ended in psychiatric hospitals. Jung never minimized these risks. The unconscious contained creative and destructive forces. Opening to it meant accepting both. This wasn't self-improvement. It was transformation. And transformation always involved the death of the old personality. Not everyone survived intact. Chapter 8. Journeys into Other Worlds. Jung needed to see the European psyche from outside. In 1925, he traveled to New Mexico to visit the Pueblo Indians. On the train west, he watched the landscape change from cities to desert. America struck him as a place racing forward without looking back. The whites had severed their roots, living entirely in consciousness in their heads. At Ta Pueblo, Jung met Owi Biano Lake. They sat on the roof of his adobe house. Mountain Lake studied Jung's face. He said whites were mad. Their eyes showed it. Always staring, always wanting something. They thought with their heads, the Pueblo thought with their hearts. Jung asked him about their religious practices. Mountain Lake grew careful. These were secrets whites had tried to destroy for centuries. Finally, Mountain Lake explained his people helped their father, the sun, cross the sky each day. Without their prayers and rituals, the sun would stop rising. Darkness would swallow the world. Jung sat stunned. Here was a people whose daily life had cosmic significance. Every morning ritual affected the entire universe. No wonder whites seemed mad to them. Whites had no such meaning. That same year, Jung sailed to East Africa. He wanted to see consciousness at its dawn. The AY plains stretched endless, covered with vast herds, zebras, antelopes, gazelles moving like a single organism. Jung felt he'd stepped back millions of years. This was the world before human consciousness separated itself from nature. Standing on a hill at sunrise, watching the herds move below, Jung had a revelation. The animals were complete in themselves. They needed nothing from human observation, but human consciousness gave them objective existence. Without a conscious observer, the world existed but had no meaning. Man was indispensable for completing creation. Through human awareness, the universe became conscious of itself. He traveled up the Nile to Egypt. At the tomb of Ramses, something strange happened. The guide lit a match to show hieroglyphs. In that brief flare, Jung saw the whole history of Egypt compressed into a moment. The rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of gods. Time collapsed. He understood how the Egyptian soul experienced eternity, how the dead remained present for them. But Africa also showed Jung something troubling. In Kenya, he watched his English companions slowly unravel. One began drinking heavily, another grew paranoid. The continent's psychic atmosphere was affecting them. They were losing their European personas, becoming what they imagined primitives to be. Jung realized colonialism created a dangerous psychological situation. Whites projected their unconscious onto the colonized, then either idealized or demonized what they saw. These journeys changed Jung's understanding of analysis. Every culture had its own psychological orientation. What healed a European might destroy an African. What made sense to an American might be meaningless to an Indian. The psyche was both universal and culturally specific. The archetypes were the same everywhere, but their expressions varied radically. Analysis had to account for this. A psychology that claimed universal validity while ignoring cultural difference was another form of colonialism. Chapter 9. Back to Europe and Alchemy. Jung returned to Europe in 1926 with a dream that wouldn't leave him. He stood in Liverpool, a city he'd never visited. Rain fell steadily. The streets were dark, arranged like spokes of a wheel. At the center grew a magnolia tree in full bloom, lit by sunlight that came from nowhere. The tree glowed in the darkness. Its roots reached deep into black earth while its flowers opened to invisible sun. Liverpool, he realized, meant pool of life. The dream showed him the self, the center of psychic totality. No matter how dark the surroundings, this center contained its own light. The image was a mandala, the Sanskrit word for magic circle. Jung had been drawing these circular patterns for years without knowing their history. Now he understood they appeared spontaneously when the psyche sought wholeness. In 1928, confirmation came from an unexpected source. Richard Wilhelm, the German sinologist, sent Jung a translation of an ancient Chinese text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. Jung opened it and felt his isolation shatter. Here were his own discoveries described in thousand-year-old Daoist language. The golden flower was consciousness. The circular movement was individuation. Ancient Chinese sages had mapped the same territory Jung was exploring. Wilhelm's text mentioned Western parallels in alchemy. Jung had dismissed alchemy as primitive chemistry. Now he looked again. He found an old book, Archetypes, and began reading. The alchemists weren't trying to make physical gold. They were projecting psychological processes onto matter. When they described mercury becoming gold, they were really describing the transformation of consciousness. Jung threw himself into collecting alchemical texts. Latin manuscripts, Greek fragments, Arabic treatises. The language was deliberately obscure. Alchemists had hidden their real work behind chemical metaphors to avoid persecution by the church. They spoke of marriage, of sun and moon, death of the king, birth of the divine child. All symbols Jung had encountered in his patient's dreams and his own visions. The discovery changed everything. Jung now had historical precedent for his psychology. The alchemists were his predecessors, working with the same material through different methods. They had created a bridge between Gnosticism and modern psychology, where the Gnostics had been destroyed by Orthodox Christianity. The alchemists had survived by disguising their spiritual work as chemistry. One image particularly struck Jung. The alchemists drew the Aurora Auris, the serpent eating its tail. They said this represented the primera materia, the first matter that contained everything needed for transformation. Jung recognized this as the unconscious itself. It consumed and renewed itself endlessly. The work of individuation was learning to relate to this circular process without being devoured by it. Emma joined him in studying alchemy. She specialized in the Grail legends, seeing them as another hidden tradition of individuation. Together, they decoded centuries of symbolic texts. The work gave their marriage new depth. They were no longer just husband and wife, but fellow investigators of the Western soul's secret history. Chapter 10. The Shadow of the Reich. Jung watched the rise of National Socialism with growing alarm. By 1933, he saw what he called a mass psychosis boiling up in Germany. The careful, rational surface of German culture was cracking. Underneath, something ancient and terrible was stirring. Jung recognized it as Wotan, the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy, the wanderer who possessed men and drove them to ecstasy or destruction. He wrote about this in an essay that would haunt him forever. Wotan had awakened in the German unconscious. The god had been dormant since the conversion to Christianity, but never died. Now he was possessing an entire nation. The torch parades, the mass rallies, the hypnotic speeches. These were Wotan's rituals. Hitler was less a man than a medium, channeling forces he didn't understand. In 1933, Jung made a decision he would regret. He accepted the presidency of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. The society was based in Germany, now under Nazi control. Jung thought he could protect his Jewish colleagues. He changed the statutes so Jewish doctors expelled from the German section could join as individual members of the international body. He kept correspondence showing he fought to maintain Jewish membership, but the damage was done. Jung had lent his name to an organization in Nazi Germany. His enemies would use this against him forever, calling him a Nazi sympathizer. The truth was more complex. Jung despised totalitarianism. He saw Nazism and communism as twin evils, both crushing individual consciousness beneath collective possession. His entire psychology was about strengthening the individual against mass-mindedness. He treated several Germans who came to him in secret during these years. They described their horror at what was happening. Decent people were becoming monsters. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Children informed on parents. Jung saw this as shadow projection on a massive scale. Germans were projecting all their inferior qualities onto Jews, then trying to exterminate what they couldn't face in themselves. The situation grew worse. Jewish analysts fled to England and America. Jung helped where he could, writing recommendations, arranging positions, but he also made statements about psychological differences between Jews and Germans that would be twisted out of context. He was trying to argue that every group had its own psychological character shaped by history, but in that political climate, any mention of difference was weaponized. By 1936, Jung saw war coming. His patients reported apocalyptic dreams, images of fire, destruction, armies of the dead. The collective unconscious was preparing for catastrophe. Jung resigned from the German Society in 1940. His name appeared on a Nazi blacklist. When France fell, Swiss authorities told him to leave Zurich. He might be kidnapped or assassinated. Jung stayed. He was Swiss. He would not abandon his country or his patients. But he knew what was coming. The shadow that Europe had refused to face was about to engulf the continent. All the darkness that civilized nations projected onto primitives was erupting in the heart of civilization itself. The most cultured nation in Europe was committing the most barbarous acts in history. Chapter 11. India and the Self. 20. Jung sailed for India in late 1937. He went not as a seeker of Eastern wisdom, but as a psychologist needing to understand a radically different approach to consciousness. India had developed sophisticated methods of inner exploration for thousands of years. Jung wanted to experience these firsthand to test his own discoveries against an ancient tradition. The Taj Mahal struck him first. Standing before it at dawn, he saw it as a monument to the principle of relationship. The Muslim ruler who built it understood something Christianity had forgotten. Love could be a path to the divine. The structure itself was a mandala, perfect symmetry, expressing the union of masculine and feminine. Islam, Jung realized, had preserved the emotional warmth that Protestant Christianity had banished. At the stupa of Sani, Jung encountered something else entirely. The ancient Buddhist monument rose from the hill like a thought-made stone. Here was the opposite of the Taj Mahal. No celebration of relationship, but the solitary path to enlightenment. The Buddha had abandoned wife and child to find truth. He had dissolved all attachments to reach nirvana. Jung felt the austere power of this path and its complete foreignness to Western psychology. In Kolkata, Jung fell ill with dysentery. For 10 days, he lay in his hotel, fevered and delirious. During this illness, he had a crucial dream. He stood on an island off the English coast. Before him lay the Holy Grail, radiating light. A voice said, this was the healing vessel Europe needed. Jung woke, knowing his task lay in the West. India's solutions couldn't be transplanted. Europe had to find its own path to wholeness. The Indians he met baffled him. They spoke of good and evil as varying degrees of the same thing. Maya illusion made all distinctions ultimately false. A holy man in Benares told Jung that Jesus and Satan were brothers, both sons of God. Jung's Western mind recoiled. Yet he saw how this perspective allowed Indians to accept life's darkness without the tortured guilt that plagued Europeans. At the Temple of Connor, covered with erotic sculptures, Jung saw sexuality integrated into religious life. The carving showed every possible sexual act as part of divine play. Christianity had split spirit and flesh, creating neurosis. Hinduism united them. But Jung noticed the Indians paid a price. They seemed less individually developed, more embedded in collective traditions. The trip's most important moment came through absence. Jung deliberately avoided meeting any gurus. He didn't visit Ramana Maharshi, though they were in India at the same time. Jung knew he could easily fall under a guru's influence, lose his Western critical faculty. His path required maintaining creative tension between consciousness and the unconscious. Eastern Enlightenment dissolved that tension entirely. Returning to Europe in 1938, Jung felt confirmed in his direction. East and West were compensatory. The East had developed the inner world while neglecting the outer. The West had mastered external reality while losing its soul. Neither path alone was complete. Individuation meant holding both, refusing to escape into either pure spirituality or pure materialism. Chapter 12, The Second World War and a Near-Death Vision. September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Jung had seen it coming in his patient's dreams for years. Images of fire, blood, cities in ruins. The collective unconscious had been preparing for catastrophe. Now it arrived. Jung felt the weight of it physically. His chest tightened. Sleep became difficult. Switzerland was surrounded by fascist powers. Jung's name appeared on a Nazi blacklist after the fall of France in 1940. The Swiss authorities knew they urged him to flee Zurich for the mountains. German agents operated freely in border areas. A kidnapping or assassination was possible. Jung refused to leave. He would stay with his patients, his family, his work. If the Nazis came, they came. He treated refugees who escaped across the border. Their stories were fragments of hell, camps, deportations, neighbors vanishing in the night. Jung saw the shadow archetype operating on a massive scale. Everything Europe couldn't acknowledge in itself was being projected and destroyed. The cultured Germans who read Goethe were running extermination camps. Civilization was a thin crust over chaos. His son France was called up for military service. Swiss men guarded the borders while invasion seemed imminent. Emma organized the household for potential siege. Blackout curtains, food stores, plans for evacuation. Jung continued seeing patients. Many were having apocalyptic dreams. The boundaries between inner and outer catastrophe dissolved. Personal neurosis seemed trivial against the backdrop of collective madness. In February 1944, Jung slipped on ice outside his house. His leg broke. Then his heart failed. For 3 weeks, he hovered between life and death. During this time, he had visions that changed him permanently. He found himself 1,000 miles above Earth. The planet floated below, bathed in blue light. He could see the Arabian desert, the snow-capped Himalayas, the Mediterranean stretching toward Gibraltar. A dark stone temple appeared, floating in space. Jung knew all his questions would be answered inside. He was about to enter when his doctor appeared in the form of the ancient Greek healer, CS. The doctor brought a message. Jung had to return. People needed him on Earth. Jung felt bitter disappointment. The vision was more real than ordinary life. Returning meant resuming the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence. For weeks after revival, Jung couldn't tolerate daylight. The world seemed like a prison. But gradually something shifted. He began experiencing what he called the mysterium conjunctionis, the sacred marriage of opposites. Day and night he felt bathed in eternal light. The nurse who attended him later said his room seemed to glow. He understood something beyond intellectual knowledge. The self was real, more real than the ego. Death was a transition, not an ending. When he recovered enough to work, Jung wrote differently. The urgency was gone, replaced by certainty. He had touched something beyond argument or proof. His remaining years would be spent articulating what he glimpsed in that space between worlds. The war ended in May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. But Jung had seen from cosmic height that destruction and creation were parts of a larger pattern. The work of rebuilding souls would be harder than rebuilding cities. Chapter 13. Reaping the Harvest. Ion and Job. After his near-death experience, Jung wrote with new freedom. He no longer tried to convince anyone. He simply recorded what he discovered. The first major work was Aeon, published in 1951. The book traced symbols of the self through 2,000 years of Christian history. Jung showed how Christ functioned as a self-symbol for Western culture, but an incomplete one. Christ represented only light, goodness, perfection. This one-sidedness created a shadow. The figure of the Antichrist arose as psychological necessity. What was excluded from the divine image had to manifest somehow. The book of Revelation showed this process. God's wrath, the destruction, the beast rising from the sea. These were Christianity's return of the repressed. The shadow of absolute goodness was absolute evil. Jung connected this to the astrological age of Pisces, the two fish swimming in opposite directions. Christianity had split reality into irreconcilable opposites, God and devil, spirit and flesh, good and evil. This split created Western civilization's dynamism, but also its neurosis. The approaching age of Aquarius would demand integration of opposites. Humanity would have to face its shadow or destroy itself. While writing Ion, Jung felt compelled towards something more personal. For decades, he'd wrestled with the problem of divine darkness. His childhood vision of God defecating on Basel Cathedral had never left him. Now in 1952, he wrote Answer to Job in a burst of passionate intensity. He wrote it, he said, in a fever, as if taking dictation from the unconscious. The book was theological dynamite. Jung argued that in the book of Job, God revealed himself as unconscious. Yahweh tortured his faithful servant to win a bet with Satan. He acted like a tyrant, demanding worship while inflicting suffering. Job maintained his integrity against divine injustice. This forced God toward consciousness. God had to become human in Christ to develop moral awareness. But the incarnation was incomplete. Christ was sinless, therefore not fully human. The crucifixion didn't redeem humanity. It was God's attempt to expedite his guilt toward Job. The real transformation would come through ordinary humans becoming conscious of their own divinity in darkness. Each individual who achieved consciousness helped God become conscious. This was the meaning of the Holy Spirit working through humanity. The book scandalized theologians. Jung was accused of blasphemy, insanity, inflation. He didn't care. He'd written what tormented him since childhood. The problem of evil couldn't be solved by theological formulas. It had to be lived, suffered, integrated. Every individual who faced their own capacity for evil without being destroyed by it contributed to the transformation of the God image. These works exhausted Jung. He was in his 70s, feeling his mortality, but he'd said what he needed to say. The Western God image was transforming. The split between good and evil was healing not through institutional religion, but through individuals doing inner work. Each person who integrated their shadow, who united their opposites, participated in the continuing incarnation. The work he'd begun in his confrontation with the unconscious was bearing fruit for humanity. Chapter 14. The Final Conjunction. The 1950s brought losses that cut deep. Toni Wolff died suddenly in March 1953. She had been Jung's colleague, collaborator, and companion for 40 years. Her death left him physically ill for months. She had understood parts of him that no one else could reach. Her analytical gifts had shaped his thinking about psychological types. Now that particular conversation was over. 2 years later came the harder blow. Emma fell ill in 1955. The diagnosis was cancer. She'd been his anchor for 52 years, raising their 5 children while he descended it to the unconscious. She learned his psychology from inside, becoming an analyst herself. Her work on the Grail legend would be published posthumously. On November 27th, she died. Jung called it the worst loss of his life. He channeled grief into stone. At Bellingen, he carved tablets with the names of his ancestors, his paternal line, his maternal line, reaching back centuries. The work connected him to what he called the impersonal karma within a family. Individual life was brief, but the ancestral stream flowed on. He was one momentary form taken by an eternal process. Despite the losses, Jung completed his opus magnum mysterium Konung Shen in 1955. The book explored alchemical symbolism of the union of opposites for 700 pages. He traced how alchemists projected psychological processes onto chemical operations. When they described sulfur and mercury combining to create the philosopher's stone, they were really describing consciousness, uniting with the unconscious to create wholeness. The alchemists knew something Christianity had forgotten. Transformation required darkness. The prima materia, the starting point of the work, was found in filth, in what was rejected. You had to descend into the shadow, integrate what you denied before ascending to consciousness. The philosopher's stone wasn't perfection, but completeness. It included everything: light and dark, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. Jung's late essays turned toward humanity's future. The Undiscovered Self, published in 1957, warned against mass-mindedness. Television, advertising, political propaganda were creating psychological conformity. Individuals were disappearing into statistical averages. The only defense against collective possession was self-knowledge. Each person who knew their own shadow couldn't be manipulated by demagogues. Flying saucers fascinated him, not as extraterrestrial vehicles, but as projections. Modern humanity, having lost religious symbols, projected the self onto technological imagery. The round glowing discs came from above, bringing superior beings. These were technological mandalas, desperate attempts by the psyche to represent wholeness in an age that had forgotten the sacred. By 1960, Jung was 85. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp. He gave his last interview to the BBC. When asked if he believed in God, he paused. Then he said he didn't need to believe. He knew this wasn't faith but empirical observation. He'd experienced the reality of the psyche, its objective existence beyond personal consciousness. Whether you called it God or self or collective unconscious didn't matter. The reality remained. Chapter 15. Back to the rhizome. In 1960, Jung had a dream that would determine his final act. He stood in a vast public space addressing a multitude who understood him. For decades, his ideas had lived in analytical journals and specialized books. But this dream suggested something different. The collective unconscious was preparing to receive what he'd discovered. When BBC producer John Freeman approached him about writing a popular book explaining his psychology, Jung initially refused. Then the dream returned more insistent. He called Freeman back. The project became Man and His Symbols. Jung's attempt to speak directly to ordinary people about the reality of the psyche. He chose his collaborators carefully. Each one someone who'd internalized his ideas through years of personal work. As he wrote through 1961, his body failing, but mind still sharp. Jung knew this was his testament. 10 days before his death, he finished his chapter. The timing felt orchestrated by the same forces he'd studied for 60 years. Those final weeks brought visions of extraordinary beauty. He dreamed of a great round stone, inscribed with words about wholeness and oneness, then of trees whose roots were golden threads rising from the earth to surround him with light. He'd often compared human life to a plant living on its rhizome, the visible part lasting one summer while the root remains. On June 6, 1961, Carl Jung died peacefully at Küsnacht, his particular flowering complete, the essential pattern returning to the eternal substrate from which new growth would emerge. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jung's closest collaborators. His ideas, which had been confined to analytical circles, began spreading through culture like water finding its level. Joseph Campbell had already begun translating Jung's insights about myth into language artists and writers could use. The Hero with 1,000 Faces showed how every culture's stories followed the same archetypal pattern Jung had identified. The hero venturing into darkness to bring back treasure for the community. This wasn't just literary analysis, but a map of psychological transformation that George Lucas would use to structure Star Wars, introducing millions to Jungian psychology without them knowing it. The therapeutic community discovered that Jung had mapped territories Freud never entered. Where Freud explained neurosis through personal history, Jung offered a larger story that included meaning, purpose, and spiritual development. Alcoholics Anonymous had already incorporated Jung's insight that addiction was spiritual thirst misdirected, building their 12-step program on essentially Jungian principles. The surrender to a higher power was acknowledgement of forces beyond ego control. Making amends was shadow integration. The program worked because it was individuation in disguise. Transformation presented in language alcoholics could accept. The 60s counterculture found in Jung what they couldn't find in Freud or behaviorism, a psychology that honored direct experience over institutional authority. While academic psychology insisted consciousness could be reduced to stimulus and response, Jung had demonstrated that psyche contained depths that couldn't be measured or controlled. The human potential movement at Esalen built directly on Jungian foundations. The idea that each person contained vast, untapped potential waiting for actualization coming straight from Jung's concept of individuation. Women particularly responded to Jung's refusal to define feminine psychology through lack or deficiency. His concept of the anima gave men permission to acknowledge their feminine aspects without shame, while his concept of the animus helped women claim their masculine power without apology. Marion Woodman would develop this into a psychology of the feminine body, showing how women's symptoms often expressed unlived life. Clarissa Pinkola Estes would use Jungian analysis to decode fairy tales as maps of feminine individuation. Her Women Who Run with the Wolves, reaching millions who'd never heard of Jung but recognized their own experience in his archetypal patterns. The hard sciences began confirming what Jung had discovered through introspection. Wolfgang Pae, the physicist who'd been Jung's patient and collaborator, had already shown that quantum mechanics suggested a reality more like Jung's synchronicity than Newton's clockwork universe. Consciousness seemed to affect matter at the quantum level, suggesting psyche and physics were aspects of one reality. Neuroscience would later discover that mythological symbols activated ancient brain structures, that the archetypes might be hardwired, patterns evolved over millennia of human experience. But Jung's most profound legacy was the transformation of how Western culture understood evil. Before Jung, evil was either sin requiring punishment or sickness requiring cure. Jung showed it was shadow, the rejected aspects of personality that got projected onto others. This psychological understanding offered hope, where theology and medicine offered only management. If evil was projection, it could be withdrawn. If enemies carried our shadows, we could reclaim those projections and end the cycle of hatred. This insight would become crucial as humanity developed weapons capable of global destruction while still operating from tribal psychology. Today, Jung's language has entered everyday speech so thoroughly we forget its origin. People talk about complexes, introverts and extroverts, shadows and personas without knowing these were Jung's discoveries. The Myers-Briggs type indicator based on Jung's psychological types helps millions understand that different doesn't mean deficient. Dream work, active imagination, and sand play therapy offer ways to access unconscious wisdom. The idea that symptoms have meaning, that crisis can be transformation, that the second half of life has different tasks than the first, all come from Jung. The Rhizome Jung return to in death continues, producing new growth. His ideas flowering in fields he never imagined. From ecology to artificial intelligence, from religious studies to pop culture, each generation discovers in Jung what it needs for its particular crisis. His core insight remains constant. The psyche is real. It has purpose beyond personal pleasure, and conscious relationship with it is the great work of human life. Jung didn't found a school or create a dogma. He opened a door and said, "Look for yourself." Millions have and continue to look, finding in their own depths what Jung found in his. The pool of life he glimpsed in that Liverpool dream keeps reflecting new light as humanity continues its long journey toward consciousness.